lens is the necessary poverty in the countries to be. To ground this discussion in the necessary context and facilitate expression, Law School Human Rights Institute. As a human rights lawyer at Defiende Venezuela and Story for Crimes Against Humanity, she represented 50 victims of human rights. Strategic litigation to see efforts extended to countries including Venezuela, Silva has trained more than 200 human rights defenders globally, equipping them with skills to navigate international human rights mechanisms, including LGBT+. Ethnic and religious minorities. Asia program. And finally, Ani Modi is a co-founder of She is active in women's rights, justice, leadership. Ani has been involved in various initiatives, including setting up a girl-led research unit and a volunteer group called the Champion Group. Initiative of young women leaders in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the Ani focuses on people's economic empowerment, sexual and reproductive health and rights, group of women in quarterly dialogue with the head of state to prioritize gender equality. Department of African American Studies.
Does this work? Okay, great. Hi. I think to start this conversation, I'm so honored to sit up with such amazing, incredible, dedicated women to anti-oppression and anti-sexism and anti-gender violence. And so I think to start this is going to kind of like a conversation as well between amazing people. So I guess to start with you, violence and what are the different forms that you've seen?
Hello, everyone. Very good to see you all, and thanks for inviting me to join this conversation. So, well, I mean, gender-based violence is very, very common in our society, not only in the country I came from. So it's harmful of violence based on the gender. And I mean, even though people only think about physical violence as a gender-based violence, but there are so many different forms of gender-based violence, which includes psychosocial violence, economic violence, and sexual violence as well. So, I mean, it's very most of the violence, I mean, gender-based violence victims are even though women and girls, but these days there are a lot of reported cases on gender-based violence on boys and men as well, and of course the LGBTQ plus community because of like their sexual orientation. So yeah.
Okay, great. I think Miss Moody. So, as we all know, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there is and there's a lot of conflict, specifically exacerbated by the world's global green energy transition and the mineral extraction and exploitation that's taking place. And I think we're all curious to know, how have you seen these proliferated cases of sexual violence as a tool of sort of the extraction, imperial nature of the economy and capitalism.
Thank you. It's an honor for me. Say people who suffer from extractivism or extraction of what they see. That's what we've said. And they keep on asking themselves, minerals, the race for cobalt, coltan, and control over mindset at local level. What people did not know, what they're sitting on, and suddenly this is fueling arms financing and conflict-related sexual violence. I think at some point it was said, 2009 to 2012, that DRC was the world capital of sexual violence, of rape, to put it. Lawlessness at the pit, whether it is artisanal or conflict affected, being exploited, health, and it's less, or sometimes even absence and conflict. There is no police. To exploitation. And the pit at the checkpoint on the road are actually victims, and poverty in supply chain power imbalance. Also, global buyers set prices and where profits exist, but the arms of extractivism or extraction of minerals remains. And there is also that imbalance of capital of concession without genuine community consent leads to displacement, militarized security, and risk of rape and sexual slavery. And they are pushed into forced labor. Group without rights, just that's what we're fighting for. Certification that misses abuses unless it's right due diligence from this mining artisanal in conflict. Electrical cars.
Okay, I think we'll start with, challenges and opportunities that you have encountered throughout all of your advocacy work. Start with you.
Yes. So to give you a bit of background from myself, I'm from Venezuela. I speak about Venezuela. Venezuela right now is kind of like the news right now in the reasons. I can remember I have been in a dictatorship in my country. I was born in 1997 and child Venezuela. That's why I said to become a lawyer. I started working that was it's called in Venezuela. What we did was basically fight before mechanisms because in Venezuela court executive for them to remain in power, and that means a lot of people of these. So gathering cases and presenting cases for mechanisms, we use the internal in the international court and finally the international court. NGOs crimes there can be on a lot of international treaties that we have right now in the room. So that's what we did, was document a lot to the criminal. I think that it's quite difficult to understand. This has been a very recent development, I think, in international law to understand sexual gender-based violence form of torture, commission of torture under international law. I don't know if humanity. So I think crimes against humanity, and later on American states on the panel of crimes against humanity, we really explored this idea of victims in the international sphere to make their voice be heard, for people to understand actually had sexual, apart from, of course, other crimes such as extrajudicial execution. Right now, with these, just to bring a little bit of cases that we documented, sadly, there were not men by women. You see working towards committing these atrocious crimes that is both sides. Some of the men inside of the house who were protesting and who were out in the streets calling for government to leave, finally have a democracy. They were telling them, like, no, you need to be at home with your children. Like, why are you here? You're a whore. Why are you pregnant and protesting? One of the protesters who was pregnant and was in prison made it jump inside of the prison, like to do exercise inside of the prison, trying to make her abortion. And they were like, yes, we're that's it type of situation right now in Venezuela. And that's the type of sexual gender-based violence that can be constituted as torture under international law.
Thank you so much. Would you like to?
Okay, so about my work, I don't know, like, familiar with our country situation. So Myanmar is the second largest in Southeast Asia. It's very beautiful and rich in natural resources and minerals too. I would say that like Myanmar has like one of the country which has the longest civil war, and a lot of that like whenever we talk about Myanmar, so we know about the Rohingya crisis, which is like one of the minority since our country is being independent from the British in 1948. The Civil War started in 1949. So, like living in a country, that was always unstable, and and also like experience already. 96, 1990 and 2021. So I grew up under the military. So we have experience, even though the leaders of the military changed, but strategies and regimes they've been using against the civilians are quite the same. So we may have to say the same kinds of impunity repeatedly happen till today. And when I talk about like gender-based violence, or the issue of gender, or when I with Gen Equality Network, one of the organizations and individuals working on promoting women rights and gender equality in Myanmar. So the words are even violence against women is very, very uncommon in our society. Whenever we introduce ourselves that, okay, I work for Gender Equality Network, and people, the very first questions, people will ask me, what? We don't have any gender equality in our country, and we don't have any, like gender-based violence or violence against women issues in our society either. So it's very difficult to talk. So, and us journalists, working closely with the government ministries of that previous government, previous so-called civilian government back in 2020 to 2010 to 2020, like as very first time our country, becomes open to, freedom of expression. Prisoners were released from the prison, including Aung San Suu Kyi, and then like we hopeful years, for these 2010 to 2020, and even though there are a lot of how to say rejections, or not willing to accept about willing to accept to talk against women or gender gender-based violence in our large community. But Jen was able to advocate successfully, for the government to accept there are a huge need for protection and prevention of violence against women in country. And then, there are huge needs of services and public awareness on prevention of violence. Preventing violence against women and stop violence against women in our society. And then we have started the law drafting process for the prevention and protection of violence against women in 2014. So it's how to say, it took 9 years to finish this draft law, but unfortunately, because of the military coups happened again in 2021, we're not able to submit to the parliament and even discuss at the parliament for the draft law, which we invested so much for about 8 years. And Jen did the very first quantitative research on violence against women in country, and then our country is also very well known for conflict-related sexual violence because, in many different of the territories which is occupied by the ethnic resistance organization. So it's our military is targeting ethnic minorities, not only Rohingyas, but also, the Kachin, where I came from. And there are about 135 ethnic minorities living in our country, and all of the minorities community, including Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and the other religions. You can say that non-Buddhist. How to say, using rape as a weapon of war, using sexual violence as oppressions from the military, and it's being over. But the international community or the world have forgotten us since we were cut off from the war since 1962, and very few people know about happenings in Myanmar. And of course, the challenges we have for advocating, not only about gender-based violence in Myanmar, but also about the how to say, of people living. So it's very hard for them to understand, why it's happened, or how they can help, right? So that is why one of our challenges is to understand at all. And since there are very few reports and very few international media, a lot of people they don't know how to help us, or they don't even know that the violence is still happening every day in Myanmar. And talk about our crisis, one of the challenges is people they understand the complexities of our. And the second thing is our political will. Whenever there are discussions at the UN about our country, how to say, and really supporting the military, because of their economics and geopolitics on our country. So it's very, very difficult and challenges for us, even, like to educate people to understand what is happening in Myanmar. Like before we talk about how women's the country, like how about how widely happen, because, like sort of impunity and international justice system is, totally ignore what the Myanmar military committed to its own people for many, many years. So like we have, of course, several challenges, and that is one of the reasons, we are putting a lot of efforts and advocating about what is happening in Myanmar and how we need international support. And then, like the issue of gender-based violence in our house.
But just to start, you wanted to know how we came about. My calling went from a personal lived experience. I would put it like that, because when the war started in 1994, I was a teenager. At 17, I became a mother. So I gave birth to a girl. I had to live, not only fight for me, also for my, because I had lost my parent already. It's a layer of challenges that has really brought me into doing something to try and change the world for my daughter that I didn't want to grow in the same environment. Sadly, 25, the situation hasn't changed that much. Having said that, I work for protection, defense, and promotion of women and girls' rights in the Congo, and try to understand the impact of extractive economy on especially sexual violence survivor in the context of conflicts in the eastern part of the DRC. But we have a lot of challenges to do, partnering with other civil society organizations and international organizations, is to push and promote for survivor-centered accountability. Because pushing for accountability then brings us to work and promote access to justice, for instance, from national to international environment. Just to add on similar challenges, in which is impunity and also the way international media is present. It's just sometimes, there's a point that I don't even watch international media anymore, because they choose an angle that will put more responsibility. We know there is shared responsibility when we have internal structural issues such as governance, corruption, impunity. Yes, we do have that, but there is also that international capitalist pressure and impact on what is happening, which is not really addressed properly. So some of other risk is security risk for us when you advocate for issues that can touch the big interests and the strong people's interest. Your security might be at risk. There is also re-traumatization concerns, because not only, even if you went through a healing, supporting new survivors and victims, you can also be re-traumatized again. So there's that ongoing healing process that we have to do for ourselves while supporting others. And there is also, I've talked about impunity, yes, but there's also very much limited data available there sometimes to support our advocacy. We only have reports that is produced by international organizations, but sometimes we have to generate our own data as a national and grassroots organization, working in the angle that we understand our social and cultural context better, and we tell a story from our own angle. And finally, I think I said it, is also that pressure from powerful interests. So it is either you lose grants, you don't access funding to do the work you're doing, or you have to conform somehow to be able to navigate and continue to work. But even though there are a lot of challenges, there are some opportunities. There is do that a lot. At least we opportunities try and promote our work, justice and reparation.
Those were because I totally, if you guys could speak society to this gender violence, I want to have the conversation.
Okay. Root causes, I think we've said some of them, but as the war continues, I think organization is one of the main root causes of violence, but there is also the economic precarity. I talked about poverty. I will come back to security and governance. You know, people putting the interest, So it's that selfishness sometimes. You see there as a legal framework and institutions that are there, but the individual who are sitting in office not not working on. So we doing the awareness, for a bit less difficult. People have trauma experiences, prepare them, when to sit and listen. We do a lot of community dialogue. Like I is guaranteed in the law, but what we are facing as challenges is availability of services. For instance, when we say access to justice, we thought we had a law that was passed that survivors of sexual violence and gender-based violence do not have to pay for judicial procedures. But in actual fact, you don't access those services freely. When you go to police station, they tell you they don't have a pen and paper. What are you supposed to do? How are they going to take the statement? So we find ourselves as NGO trying to supply we want for survivors to access justice. Same thing with health, for instance. That is a challenge. Gender-based sexual violence survivor need to access this within the 72 hours. But then when they go to hospitals, sometimes there is just no medication, but they tell you the service is free. So what we have to do is fundraise, not for the work we're doing, but also sometimes supply actual services and goods to state institutions so that survivors, when we refer them, they can access service. But again, we still hope, because we have a legal framework that is very much protecting and promoting the rights of the people, that someday we will get the right people ruling and finally enjoy the rights.
Okay, so it's like we lived under the military for like since our country's independence from, right? So it's very dominated, and like the geographically as well, Myanmar is just between India and China. Which of the countries very much like patriarchal society and very male dominant communities, countries. So, and social norms which the communities like strongly believes are on based on gender stereotypes as well as like the biases, right? So and the attitude of how to say majority versus and the attitude of like we versus them, and our when we are talking about majority versus minority is our countries, the situation is majority populations are Buddhists, are Burmese, and we have several minorities ethnic groups which are from the other how to say religious minorities like Christian, Muslims, and Hindus. So since the majorities Burmese Buddhist community always thinks that they are the majority, they are us, and they always seeing the minorities community as them. They are very different with us, right? So in addition to the military rules, but we have a lot of divisions and hatred within the community as well. So that is why, like when we talk about the root causes, it's also because of ongoing political crisis, inequalities, poverty, and then the very internet conflict. There are a lot of places and to another, right? Situations, vulnerabilities, and not only towards women and girls, but also towards LGBT plus community boys as well. So how we are handling these situations, right? So women's groups really play a vital roles on how to say raising awareness to the community, as well as helping survivors of the violence, as well as provide necessary support. And nearly the whole community is experiencing how to say human rights violations, suppressions, discriminations. It's difficult to talk about the resource needed for the gender-based violence survivors, or the resources for us to do more public awareness for the general community as well, right? Because people are dealing every day with hand to mouth, right? And a lot of international foreign aids are also cut off. And for example, the AID funding cuts really negatively impact on Myanmar as well. Like a lot of people who are relying on international development aids on their education, as the food shelter, they are now struggling, with nearly no resources at all. So when we are when the majority population is dealing with like hand to mouth program, when they are hungry, when they don't have food to eat, like of course they don't want to listen to, like gender-based violence or sexual violence or whatever. So that is why it is very challenging for us, like to make awareness to our community as well. And violence is actually kind of like a circle, and like since there is no rule of law and no justice system they could go and complain for. So like when my sister talk about, like police, they don't have any pens or paper, but in our case, police and the security forces are the one who's committed, gender-based violence, and these are all crimes of humanity. So the whole rule of law and justice system is broken, and people have nowhere to go and complain about, like the gender-based violence cases. All these burdens really are put upon the women's groups, and like women's groups are struggling with very limited resources and doing their best for like helping the violence, gender-based violence survivors for for social, providing safe house and temporary shelter for them. And of course, like we do a lot of public awareness campaign. And since the security risks towards the women's-led organizations as Jen, so we cannot able to do like community mobilizations or campaigns at the communities level, because like targeted from the we are not openly able to operate inside of the country. So what we have to rely on is very much on social media platforms. A lot of social media campaign using different platforms like YouTube, and also like Facebook. Or like we produce is so important, and like why this issue is open, we need to talk about, because like there are shame and victim are huge in the community, and like since the victims who would like to disclose about their experiences, they will receive negative comments and blame from the community. By talking about our cases, there's no mechanisms, like for them to pursue any accountability. So, like silence is also the one who they can rely on, and with very limited resources, we will help them all of our best. Issue we have say is so the national community or the UN talk about the gender equality or gender-based violence. All these are just on paper, and like most of the donors, they are thinking some grants tackle issues, and of course this is very rooted in the of which 1 or 2 years projects funding, right? So we need long-term resources to help the huge need of gender-based violence survivors in our community. Like the even though they seem to care about gender-based violence or women's rights or gender equality, but in so like we have a lot of challenges for resources from them, and like and talking about specifically about our country, the main root cause is militarizations, until unless we could remove from our country politics, for program or whatever, how to say, services we are providing right now will not be last long. It's sad like that. The main perpetrator, and like if we would like to address the root causes, we have to remove them from their power.
Thank you so much. So I think I'm gonna pass our last question that we have pre-selected to Marianne, and then we're gonna open it up. We only have 10 minutes, so but yeah. So I think for our last question, survivors of gender-based torture or violence often face additional layers of stigma, fear, silence, fear of being judged. How can legal and human rights frameworks be better equipped to address the needs of survivors? And how can we as people in society better support survivors of gender violence?
Thank you for the question. I think this question has a lot of layers, so I will try to explain it in a way that focuses on the challenges and what we can do to address those challenges. So yes, I think justice for victims might look a bit different depending on the context and depending on the victim and depending on who committed. I would recommend you reading, if it's of interest of you, is the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, with two very good cases in order to understand what are the responsibilities of the state, not only when the state commits the violence, but also when a third party commits the violence, because in both situations, the state needs to answer. And they really, really focus, these cases are, sorry, that I didn't mention, is sexual violence committed against women in Atenco versus Mexico and Lopez Soto versus Venezuela. The first one involves a case in Mexico and later on were subject to sexual torture. And then the other case is a woman who was subjected to, who was in Venezuela. She was kidnapped in the city by a man who was involved with the government, but very farly involved with the government, still considered a third party. And he literally subjected her to torture, and he exercised property against her. So literally it was enslavement, something that was quite interesting for the court to analyze in that decision because it was considered sexual slavery. So in both cases, the court, what they tried to push in the reasoning is that the state needs to punish the responsibles. They also have the obligation to investigate, of course, and to redress the victims from whatever and whomever committed that violence. And that's why we as society need to push for that. The obstacles for victims are, as my co-panelists have discussed a lot, is impunity, because the state often follow these advice. They do not investigate, sometimes because of their own stigma against women. In a very, very landmark case, again, of the Inter-American Court, it was Campo Algodonero versus Mexico, which is cotton field versus Mexico. 3 women were found dead in a ditch in Mexico. And the to investigate, like, where are they? Because they were disappeared at first. They said, no, they're women, they're young, they're probably just running, and they ran away with men. And that's why they didn't investigate. And later on, the women were found dead. And that's why the court found that actually the state had committed a violation against their rights because they did not investigate. And therefore, later on, they did not punish even the individuals. So we really need to push forward for the state to actually take into account the claims of the victims and to follow up with them to actually see what happened in the cases. The same with the laws. This is a very important point. There's some laws right now that are being used in order to criminalize forward with a claim of sexual violence. This can be, for example, in Peru, there was a woman who was protesting for women's rights, and because she was exercising her freedom of speech for our work in Trial Watch, that they're being used criminal defamation lawsuits against women who speak out against their aggressors. And that's unacceptable. Here in the US, there's a lot of cases as well, but on a civil, in the criminal, we're seeing a bit more in Southeast Asia / Latin America, which women also face prison just because of speaking out for a situation that is against their well-being, is against their dignity as human beings. For me, it's just crazy to think that parliaments are allowing still, up until today, to have, for example, defamation as a criminal offense. Something we need to put. A lot of international organizations have said we need to stop criminalizing defamation. And of course, there's a bunch of obstacles for victims to file complaints. Not trained to understand correctly what a sexual violence claim means. And that's why, as society, as human rights defenders, as organizations, we need to push for the training of these people into how to deal with victims of gender-based violence and how to address these concerns. Because if not, they're just going to, either they are not going to be able to take the complaint seriously, or there's definitely not going to be a case even regarding of what's going on. So in these cases that I mentioned, the Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court later on said that the state has a reinforced diligence. And that means that the state basically needs to reinforce their protocols surrounding gender-based violence, because sometimes even the evidence can go away in these cases. So you really need the state to be behind the evidence, trying to as best as they can, and they usually don't have these practices. So I think that summarizes a lot of things. I'm sure that my co-panelists maybe want to add something else before we end, but
I think we'll open it up for questions. We also have some that people who RSVP'd, you guys sent it to, but yes.
First of all, good evening, and thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to come and be here with us today. This was extremely informative. My name is Hadi. I'm a veteran of the United States Air Force, served for 4 years. A common through line here seems to be the effects of armed conflict and how they exacerbate gender-based violence. My question is twofold. First, in circumstances where warfare or the militarization of the state break that victims of gender-based violence can utilize to seek justice, what do you do? Who has responsibility? Does it then become an international kind of jurisdiction? And then my second question is, in the case that it does, how do you make sure that the interests of other states or corporations don't end up becoming, or that the that the face of gender-based violence or intervening on behalf of people who are doesn't end up being an excuse that states utilize, to pursue other motives. I think of a lot of the justification that the U.S. used to extend our occupation in Afghanistan was the so-called protection of women's rights in the country. In the case of Venezuela, you have a massive buildup of American military power as we speak in the Caribbean, with a high risk of escalation. And how do you prevent these things from becoming co-opted?
I will start, I think, with the first part. So for a crime, in order to become a crime against humanity and a crime that can be tried in some other parts of the world, it needs to showcase several elements that common human rights violations usually don't show. And I know this sounds very crazy, but try to try to follow me, because the world is thought that you usually will get justice in your own system. So if you manage to exhaust the local remedies inside of your country, you can access international or regional mechanisms of human rights violations, and there you can try to make yourself heard. So that's what usually victims do in repressive environments that domestic systems cannot fulfill. For example, Venezuela. In Venezuela, we cannot go to courts, or even if we do, we're years without any reparations for the victims or accountability. So that's why the Inter-American Court, for example, has an exception to the exhaustion of local remedies in order for the court to hear a petition. So you can go to the court, introduce a claim, and then the court can say whether the claim has merit or not, and then the state needs to repair. And there's different ways of reparation. The court has said, for example, that there are 5 actually. That is restitution, monetary reparation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition. So that you can try to achieve through regional and other universal human rights mechanisms, like the UN Human Rights Committee. You can also introduce a claim there and try to see if the state participates, because sometimes they don't participate, and therefore if they comply with the decision. I think that that's the most challenging part of regional and universal mechanisms of human rights, because sometimes you can try to achieve justice, but sometimes you can't. And then you have another mechanism that is not international. When international criminal law enters into place, it enters when you have something that is a pattern and is against the civilian population, and it's not simply a human rights violations when it fulfills the elements to become a crimes against humanity. And I think the word really to understand this is that it needs to be a pattern. It cannot be one single abuse. When that happens, there are some other mechanisms in place and some other courts that you can try to knock the door and see if you can get justice. So you can go to the International Criminal Court, which is very difficult for them to open up an investigation, and it's very difficult for them to have the state even ratify the Rome Statute. Even the US is not part of the Rome Statute. Venezuela, surprisingly, is, which you would think that by now they would just get out of the treaty, but they didn't. So that's why in the case of Venezuela, we actually went to the International Criminal Court and started that avenue. I have worked myself in cases in which the perpetrator is not a state, but is a non-state actor. I worked with the first prosecutor of the ICC in a consultancy, who were victims of Al-Nusra, which is a terrorism group, to get this in domestic courts, because sometimes other domestic courts from other countries allow you to bring claims if they have universal jurisdiction into their own domestic systems. So the claim that we brought was actually against Qatar. So Al-Nusra was Syria and committed the crimes in Syria, but the people who were financing Al-Nusra was Qatar, the Qatar banks. So who did we target to get some justice and accountability? Because if we couldn't get the perpetrators, Qatar. So there's ways. You need to be creative and you need to try to think in a more broad sense to try to see them, but there's ways to get them, which might be difficult, but it's possible. So
okay, I will take the community angle because we have the legal angle already from the lawyer. But nevertheless, I'll say in the case, in context where there is conflict, the challenge is to document evidence. Because if have evidence, then you will not even have, you will have a story to tell, but not a case to lay a complaint about. So the biggest challenge we are facing as I sit here, for instance, Goma Bukavu is overtaken by an armed group, and we have data. And in this environment, even health service providers sometimes are also attacked because they don't have to record some cases, because health information data can also be a source of evidence to demonstrate how sexual violence is being used as punishment, for instance. So unless we find ways to navigate that challenge, we can then get to the second level. What we're doing now is we have trained some community activists and paralegals who are able to do the least they can do with their cell phones to document, send it out and delete, because if they document, your life is also. And sometimes we work with some service providers who will let us know, alert. We have like an early warning system to have cases where they are. But it is extremely difficult to extract controlled zone to have them access justice. That's another challenge. So what we are doing in our case, like it's been going on for 30 years, so we've learned our experience on how to navigate some challenges, is we investing a lot in documenting the evidence, and our priority now for those who are in the conflict zone is not access to justice, because that will expose them more. It is healing and the capacity to keep evidence and to find ways to communicate. What is helping a lot in the context is also technology. When Goma and Bukavu was taken, they closed down internet, but because they needed internet for their own propaganda, they were glad to open it up. And secondly, is also invest in in a kind of war. So it is a narrative of community against narrative of the perpetrators. So that is for your second question. I will just join what she said. We do a lot of interests mapping. Who is interested in this? Who has interest financing, and what are the countries that has power in the north, that we can hold them accountable of the or the companies, the impacts of the activities on human rights in the context where we are working. So we do a lot of advocacy and briefing in the UN, either it's UN Security Council here, I've briefed them more than 3 times, or in Geneva, or we go in the egg again, trying to raise awareness and attention on the responsibility of citizens. And sometimes we manage to have, like America, we have sanctions, or European Union, we have targeted sanctions against some companies or individuals, economic sanction or even immigration sanctions. They will freeze the money accounts which are in the country. So we find ways to hold people accountable.
I think we have one more question. We have time for one more question. That is brief. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you guys for coming and speaking. It's very informative. I was interested in international media is complicit in essentially stripping women gender balance voice and essentially a political community. In like the sphere of geopolitical governance. And I wanted to ask you, like, what ways, because like refugees isn't even like globally recognized gender violence as a means of persecution. And so even when victims of gender violence appeal their like cases to like the global community and like receive asylum or refugee status, I wanted to ask you what you think is the constituting within a means of like recognition of gender violence after they escape our control zones. If that makes sense.
I have cases of women who have escaped conflict zone, who are, some of them are in Europe, some of them, and the only to support them with was the recording of their situation when they were being victims or right after. It does help in some countries that still have working administration and the rule of law. But the main challenge is also, when a woman is raped in some context, they don't talk about it because they are afraid of stigma. Their husband will chase them away. Their family, it's like they bring shame on their families. But when we have some cases, some will refuse to go public about it, but at least will record their situation. And later on, if they get out of the country, we can then have those evidence and send it to whatever procedure, immigration or home affairs, whatever they're asking for their exile. It does help them a lot when we have data. So I would insist again, that's what we try telling our community when we raise awareness, is to speak out and for administrative purposes. But for me, I just want to clarify something. International media, it's not that they do not talk about gender-based violence, but they choose. They will get overwhelmed by international media looking for me when they've been violence against women during election. So the angle will be probably electoral commission to show that the ruling power, for instance, are not respecting human rights, but not necessarily when we as the women come out and want to speak about what is priority for us. Like now, priority is women are being raped in Goma or Bukavu. Human rights defenders are being targeted specifically with sexual violence. But I haven't gotten any positive response to talk about that in international media. But you will see when they talk about DRC, they talk about a Washington, D.C. agreement between two countries. They talk about going and analyzing them, you find there is interest on mineral transactions, called gold, copper. So like international media also is in the service of capitalism and the big people's interest. So when our cause can serve the purpose, of course, we do have the microphone to speak on the international media. Just wanted to make that clear.
I will just add just a few things because I think Ms. Modi did a good job of answering that. But I would say first on the question of media, sometimes we see media also stigmatize the women who speak out, for example, against rape, and they showcase them as someone who is not a perfect victim. I think we have in our heads a perfect victim, and we think that the victim needs to be someone who was, randomly attacked by night and was a perfect citizen. And that's usually not the case. We usually have cases in which victims are human and they don't want to follow the same pattern. I think it just, this idea of the perfect victim also makes the media portray some cases
worst or literally objectifying the victim and saying that they don't have a right to their aggressors. We've seen right now where the victim was the assistant to a very, very high profile lawyer escort, and that's why he had the right to sue her for defamation, criminal defamation. She's facing, no, she was actually already convicted to a fine of $6,000, and if she doesn't pay that, she will get in prison for a year. And it's like, I mean, of course, we cannot have a perfect victim, and why is this the perception of the media against her just because she likes to wear short skirts and go to parties? You're a person, you can do that. You're allowed to do whatever you want with your life. So even the court in the reasoning was like, yes, she actually went to a party after, so she must not be very sad about it after she did the meeting with the ministry against sexual violence. It's like, that is, what if that's her way of coping with things? I mean, so that, and on the law, I would say there's a lot of mechanisms and treaties that already has, in some sort of way, the rights of victims of sexual and gender-based violence. You have the ICCPR with the fair trial rights, freedom of expression, non-discrimination, that taken all together can be, of course, rights of victims of sexual and gender-based violence. You also have a lot of soft law recognizing the rights of victims of sexual gender-based violence. So I think it's pushing the states to maybe codify something, because right now soft law is not enforceable. When you're part of a treaty, the state actually has an obligation to do it. If it's soft law and it's like a recommendation or something that the special rapporteur said or some guiding principles, states can take it, but sometimes they don't take it seriously. So something might really trying to push forward in the negotiations an angle for sexual and gender-based violence victims and survivors. So yes. Okay, I'd like to invite our closing statement and my co-organizer, Viviana.
Okay, I'm going to keep this really short, but really quickly, we'd like to thank our speakers for their time, their participation, and their thoughtful statements. I know this was really informative. I hope it was informative to everybody that came today. We'd also like to thank our co-organizing student group, American Students Association, the Princeton Latin American Students Association, and the Society of African Internationals at Princeton have been really supportive and thoughtful in how they've contributed to this event. And then lastly, we want to thank our departmental co-sponsors, without whom we couldn't have put this event together. So firstly, that's peers who primarily funded this event, as well as the program in African Studies, the Africa World Initiative, and the Share Peer program. Everybody for coming out today. If you would like, there are additional materials and pamphlets that there's left at that table or left. So just grab some on your way out. Thank you.